In music, there are some genres that only make sense when performed at a small scale, in the intimacy of a chamber, of a tiny recital hall where the number of people in the audience may barely outnumber the musicians. There are some forms of music that only seem to make sense in a dance club with hundreds or thousands of people jumping up and down beneath blinking lights. And there are some forms of music that are specially composed to be performed in a stadium over huge speakers with a certain amount of echo and a certain amount of reverb and a certain amount of delay. It only makes sense in that format for that audience. In the same way, implicitly, there are modes of political reasoning that only make sense to the enthusiasts who believe in them at a small scale, at a medium scale, and at an enormous scale. And it's really important to challenge people by switching between those frames of reference, by saying, yes, you believe in this towering abstraction when it's applied to this notion of society or the whole world, but can you make sense of it on the scale of a single household, of a single neighborhood, of a single city, or of a small country? There's a great deal of grandstanding right now in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, the rise and fall of the Black Lives Matter protests. Everyone wants to be on the right side of history. This phrase, we'd like to imagine it's associated with great courage, right? Stepping forward to be on the right side of history, sacrificing yourself or your comfortable bourgeois existence to make sure you're on the right side of history. But what I see in the year 2020 is a great deal of cowardice. What I see are political commentators and analysts who've managed to go the whole way through the year 2020 without making a single simple statement about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. There are a whole lot of people who see what's wrong with the Defund the Police movement, its myriad incarnations, the police abolitionist movement, as it's now called, and they are not stepping forward to let their voices be heard. They are not engaging in constructive criticism. They are not engaging in public education or debate, not even when that's their full-time job as an author, as an analyst, as a commentator, as a YouTuber. I am aghast to see that J.J. McCullough, supposedly conservative commentator here on YouTube, all these months have gone by. Seems like he just has nothing to say about the death of George Floyd, the rise and fall of Black Lives Matter movement. And here, he's in the same part of Canada I'm in, here in the Pacific Northwest. We're just not that far away from Seattle and Portland, Oregon. We feel the reverberations of these things in that part of the United States of America quite keenly. And there's a great deal to say. And there's a great deal to be learned from mutual analysis. Frankly, there's a great deal to be learned from being wrong and then later noticing that you were wrong and learning from your mistakes. And there is absolutely nothing to be learned from silence. And this kind of defensive silence I see across the whole moderate middle of the political spectrum, all the pragmatists terrified to be on the wrong side of history on this issue. It's really especially shameful. It's really especially blameworthy. What would I say if I had a friend who supported police abolitionism, who supported defunding the police? I'd talk through a few different hypotheticals, and these hypothetical exercises would challenge them not to think about this issue on the largest scale imaginable, on this kind of stunning, grandiose scale of, they will say things like, the whole world will be better if there were no police and there were no prisons and there were no oppression, right? So that's everything is as abstract and generalized as possible. And yet it's much more difficult for them to think it through and come to positive conclusions when we think at the level of a household, a neighborhood, a small country, so on and so forth. What if we had a law saying that within every household, within every home, no policeman shall set foot, no law shall apply, no laws shall ever be enforced? That within the privacy of a home, of a household, the father and mother make up their own sense of right and wrong, carry out their own rules of justice, and the people's court has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. Right? This is a very ancient notion of how to organize a society. And right away, you can think through the terrible implications this would have. What if a family just decides they don't want to put their kids into school? They want to raise their kids illiterate, or they're crazy religious fundamentalists. They don't want their kids going to public school. No. Then we want the government to step in and intervene. What if the father is just an alcoholic who beats up his wife and kids? No. Then we want the government to intervene. In fact, for most people, the center, the pragmatic middle of the political spectrum, even more so on the far left wing, they want all kinds of constant government intervention, all kinds of intrusion of the law and police authority into the privacy of the home on this small scale. How about private businesses? What if we just abolished the police or defunded the police within the four walls of every shop, of every restaurant, of every private business? You say, hey, look, it's up to the employer and the employees to sort out their own sense of justice, their own sense of right and wrong, have their own negotiations and their own conflict resolution mechanisms, and the government and the courts and the police have no place in it. The police officers will never step in. You don't think there are some businesses that would refuse to hire people because they're black? There aren't some businesses that would be racially prejudiced in their hiring practices? You don't think there are some businesses that would refuse customers because they're black? Now again, the whole moderate middle of the political spectrum, and even more on the left wing, actually wants a very active police presence governing all the things corporations and companies do. They don't want to live in a world where black people walk into a car rental business and the owner of the car rental business just says, look, I've had a lot of bad experiences with black customers and I'm not interested in renting to black people anymore. Where they have the freedom to say that and do that and say, hey, it's a private business. The government doesn't regulate this sort of thing. They're at liberty to do business with whomever they choose and to refuse anyone they choose. And if that's on the basis of racial prejudice, of racism, then that's their right. It's their freedom. Nobody, I can't say nobody wants this. There's a radical element of the right wing that wants this kind of lawlessness. There are anarcho-capitalists, there are right-wing libertarians, there are neo-Nazis who want this. But these left-wing people, that's not the kind of society they want to live in. So why are you talking about abolishing the police? Why are you talking about abolishing prisons? Why are you talking about, even at this small scale, it's unthinkable. And as you scale it up and scale it up, in fact, the problems become worse and worse, not better. But somehow you, the hypothetical left-wing person who's bought into this police abolitionism, defund the police, Black Lives Matter movement, they manage to think in the most flattering way possible about this parallel universe in which there are no police and there is no prison system, there's no punishment, there's no oppression, by just describing it as being for all mankind, for all the world, or for that most abstract notion of all, for society, that society would be a better place than policing. Now, there's also a cultural and national level of abstraction here. The internet has changed the world. When I was a kid in Toronto, I knew a lot of immigrants. Probably most people I knew were new immigrants. And a lot of them said things like, back in their own home country, there was no crime of this sort. So you could meet people from all over the world and they'd say, oh, here in Toronto you have graffiti. Back in my old home country, there's no graffiti. Hungarians would say, oh, all this stuff you have here with gays and lesbians, we don't have that back in Hungary. There are no gays and lesbians in Hungary. They really believed this. They had this memory of the old country. Okay, what if you met someone who was a Turkish immigrant to Canada and they told you, in Turkey, we don't need to have police enforce the law at all. We don't need to have prisons. We don't need to. You would be dumbfounded. You would say, what are you saying? What are you saying about the Turkish people? You think they're angels? What are you saying about Turkish culture? How can Turkey be so fundamentally different from the rest of the world? Are you saying there are no crimes committed, whether that be burglary or theft or rape or revenge or honor killings? I mean, this is the thing. Even in countries where people adhere to incredibly strict religious and cultural codes of conduct, by that same token, there's violence and conflict whenever those codes of conduct are broken. Do you think nobody in Turkey ever disputes who should inherit their father's fortune when their father dies? You don't think there's any role for the government getting involved in settling a case like that. If you pass this law that the government will never set foot into people's private business this way, just to restrict the scope of the police state that much, the authority of the police and government-written laws, people are going to kill each other. Just as they did in medieval times and ancient times, they're going to kill each other over who inherits their father's fortune, or it could be a tiny amount. It could be who inherits their father's car or their father's corner store or whatever there was to be inherited. Family disputes of that kind. The fact that in the medieval and ancient past they weren't resolved by police or by courts of law in many cultures around the world doesn't mean that they were resolved peaceably or amiably. If it's inconceivable that this notion of abolishing the police could work on the scale of the family, of the city, of even a country the size of Turkey, if talking it through this way it's inconceivable, why is it conceivable to you in the realm of these towering abstractions? And it's because these people have trained themselves to think in terms of abstractions only. And that's the most fundamental conflict in politics in the 21st century. It's not the conflict between left and right, it's the conflict between pragmatist and abstractionist. There are those of us who are reasoning from the ground up in the world of tangible things, and there are people who are reasoning from the chalkboard, from abstract equations and formulas drawn on a chalkboard, and then they're trying to take these abstract things and make them real in the real world. And those people, the people who believe in lines on a chalkboard, even if they think they're atheists, even if they think they're secular, they're actually engaging in a religious mindset. They're drawing up ideals. They're then idealizing the world and asking if only the world could live up to these idealized expectations. And down that road is the Spanish Inquisition. There's another very fundamental error, and I've been waiting for someone in my audience to ask me to comment on this. There's a fundamental error in the approach of Black Lives Matter and the whole left wing of the political spectrum. I've been waiting for someone to ask me, what would my solution be for racism in the Western world, looking ahead to what remains of the 21st century and into the 22nd century? The fundamental error that Black Lives Matter is making is that they reason through racism subtractively. They look at a racist society and think that they can simply subtract racism. And it won't work. The way to overcome racism is not by subtracting something negative. It's by adding something positive. You may not have known conscious racists. So people who are racist and who are aware of their racism. They're not in denial about it. I have. And if you get to know those people, they actually do have anecdotes in their lives about meeting a person from this other race that they say they despise or are against, that they would never let their daughter marry, where they really liked the guy and really got along with the guy and they thought he was a great guy, and maybe they're even still friends to this day. And for them, this is not a contradiction as follows. Now, I just mentioned it's not particular to the black versus white divide. This includes the Cambodian versus Vietnamese divide and the Chinese versus Mongolian divide. I am familiar with many forms of racism that are very deeply felt. Another one would be Russians against Jews. It's impossible to exaggerate the intensity of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, where they utterly regard Jewish people as a completely different race of man from Russians and Eastern Europeans. But nevertheless, they will have been in some situation in their private life, in their business life, or in some like university. Let's say they go to a chess tournament and someone who is openly and consciously anti-Semitic ends up meeting and making friends with someone who's a chess champion who's Jewish. And it's because there's something positive they both admire, they both appreciate, they both struggle to be the best at they could possibly be. You meet anti-Semitic people who've actually met and spent time with someone else who they're both into competitive chess, and they remember that that was a great guy, and they really respect him, or they respect his intelligence, they respect his perspective on chess. You will meet white people who are racist against black people and say terrible things about black people, and they never let their daughter marry a black person. But you know there was one time when they went to an archaeological conference, and there was a black guy there giving a presentation on the same kind of archaeology, and you know, they met that black guy, and they went out to dinner, and they got along great. Now, the problem with this is, of course, it doesn't negate their racism. They remain racist. They remain nonetheless prejudiced against other black people whom they have nothing in common with. But just having this one thing in common becomes a bridge to exploring your common humanity, however you want to put it. It becomes a path forward from the ugly, isolating bigotry of racism, and it breaks down the deep-seated presumption that you or your race or nationality is somehow intrinsically and intellectually superior to people on the other side, right? Not everyone can be a chess champion. Not everyone can be an archaeologist. Not everyone can be a comedian. All of the most racist people I've ever known or met had comedians specifically they admired and considered to be brilliant, who were across the divide of the whatever the people were that they hated or despised. Very often those comedians were making jokes that appealed to them too. What is the hat that everyone can wear? In Confucian society, it was the literature of Confucius. And poverty-stricken farmers in small villages who didn't have access to universities and didn't even have access to tutors could study the poetry that Confucius studied, the Book of Odes, and they could study the writings of Confucius, and they could be recognized as and respected as refined gentlemen at court or in various social fora. They could elevate themselves, and they could have something. They could overcome the unbelievable class barrier and snobbery that defined Chinese traditional society. Can you imagine a world in which we have some common corpus of literature, in which we have something that we engage in positively, individually, but as members of the same society, that brings people together, that lets them evaluate one another, that lets them appreciate one another, that lets them build on that common ground? When people have this kind of common ground, even if they differ, even if they hate and despise each other, even if they think, that guy has the wrong approach to chess. That guy, his view of archaeology is completely the wrong way around. There will still fundamentally be that respect. There's a kind of mutual respect, even if it's about issues that are contested by both sides, that defies, that overcomes, as I say, this backward, childish bigotry, racism as we know it in the real world. The question I have for the future of a multicultural, post-genocidal, post-slavery culture, such as we have here in the United States, Canada, Australia, the fragments of the British Empire, is what could that literature possibly be? What could it be that we all study and that we have in common some appreciation for, even if differing views of? That answer is much easier to give for a country like France, a country that is not built on genocide. All right. Now, the French did commit atrocities throughout their empire all around the world, even in North Africa, let alone Cambodia. That's not, within the territory of France and Europe, the indigenous people are the French. Germany, quite a few genocides on their hand. Germany certainly has a storied history of genocide. Nevertheless, the indigenous people of Germany are German. So you don't have to look too far to find a history and a literature that can be meaningful to them and can give people this kind of powerful, positive common ground to overcome racism, in the same way that the literature of Confucianism, which I'm not a fan of, provides a kind of hat that in Chinese culture, in Chinese civilization, everyone could wear. For the United States, for Canada, for Australia, if you ask me, what is that literature? What could it possibly be? My answer is, I don't know. But I feel that the single most important political question we can ask is not about cutting the policeman's budget. If you really want an alternative to racism, if you really want to overcome the unfathomably evil history of genocide and slavery that these British Empire colonies were built on, you have to find or you have to create that literature to provide that common ground for our future.